Accumulo All-Stars here to finish off the day. Josh Elser and Billy Rinaldi from Hortonworks.
High five. Hey everybody, I'm Billy, this is Josh. We are going to talk about some new improvements in managing, monitoring, and authentication for Accumulo that will be out in the next version of Accumulo and the next version of Ambari. Josh and I work for Hortonworks, and these will also be in the next release version of the Hortonworks distribution for Hadoop HDP 2.3. So we're going to cover three main topics. One is allowing Ambari to install, configure, and monitor Accumulo. This is a new feature. Ambari is an open source Apache project that has been installing HDFS and other projects or services in the Hadoop ecosystem, and it being able to install Accumulo will be new in the next version. We're also going to talk about Kerberos user authentication. Versions 1.5 and 1.6 of Accumulo supported Kerberos authentication for the server processes, but users logging into or connecting to Accumulo still needed to provide username and password authentication. So now we're able to do authentication with a Kerberos principle. No passwords are needed anymore, and instead of the root user, you provide a root principal that will have the same super user privileges as the standard Accumulo root user. Any principal that tries to connect to Accumulo will be able to, but it will still need Accumulo permissions granted to it, like table read, table write, etc. And these will need to be granted by the root principal. And lastly, or mainly Josh actually, overhauled the Accumulo Metrics System to make it use the Hadoop Metrics2 system, and this which will allow, Metrics2 basically transparently supports by configuring the files appropriately, you can send it to Graphite, Ganglia, and the new Ambari Metrics System, which will be coming out with the next version of Ambari. So the first section, Ambari has been around for about 3 years or so. It's a completely open source project for managing and monitoring your Hadoop cluster. Let's see, so basically you start up an Ambari server, and it starts up, installs and starts Ambari agents on all of the nodes in your cluster. It will do all of the RPM installs for you on all of the nodes of the services that you choose. There's a UI wizard for configuring all of the services, which makes things a lot easier, and it will, sort of automatically coordinate the configs. So once you specify, say, the name node host, that will automatically get filled in to other services that need to know where the name node is, like the Accumulo instance volumes property uses the name node. Same with zookeepers. Let's see, and actually, once you go through the configuring and installation step, there's a dashboard in Ambari that shows you the status of all the services that are running. You can alter their configs and restart them, stop them, and perform management that way. And there are also some UI metrics available. So I'm not going to go through the entire Ambari installation process, but I'm going to show a couple of screenshots that highlight where the Accumulo support can be found now. So when you select the stack to install, you'll want to select the HDP 2.3 stack. And then when you choose your services, Accumulo will now appear on the list of services to install. You'll at least also want to install HDFS and Zookeeper, which Accumulo requires, and Ambari Metrics if you want to use the Ambari Metrics System for collecting the Accumulo metrics. In the Assign Masters step, you'll be able to select hosts for the Accumulo master, garbage collector, monitor, and tracer processes, in addition to other master type components you have, like the name node and Zookeeper servers. And you'll also be able to select which nodes you want to have your T servers running on. In the Customize Services step, you'll be able to edit the Accumulo configs. Normally, when you run an Accumulo init, you have to specify the root password. So here, you'll type the Accumulo root password into the UI. Let's see, the default install also introduces a trace user that is different from the Accumulo root user. So you also have to specify the password for that, and you have to type in the instance secret, which is a shared secret among Accumulo server processes. There are config sections, if you just scroll down on the same page, for the Accumulo env configuration file, which has various heap sizes that you need to set. And you can also set all of your Accumulo site properties to the UI here as well. Note that the instance volumes and instance Zookeeper host are automatically populated, as I mentioned. You can set all your ports, and various memory properties here. And there are a few properties that show up by default, but any Accumulo site property you want to configure, you can just add that as a custom property as well. Once it starts up, Accumulo appears on the dashboard. We don't have any metrics showing up for Accumulo yet, although the metrics are being collected and getting written into the Ambari Metrics System. The UI integration is not quite there yet. I may do a little more work on that before your HDP 2.3 is actually released, but I don't have anything to show you. If you look under Quick Links, you'll get a link to the Accumulo Monitor UI. And there's an integrated alerting system. So I went in and I killed the garbage collector process. And after a little bit, Ambari noticed that the garbage collector was down, and that came up as an alert in the UI. When a service is down, you can then go under your service actions and choose to start services again. The start doesn't have any effect on services that are already running, so issuing start would then just start back up the garbage collector. And there are a few other service actions you can take. You can download client configs, restart, etc. So that completes the Ambari management and monitoring overview. Now I'm going to hand it over to Josh for the Kerberos and metrics integration.
Thanks, Bailey. As much as you want to believe me in a sponsored talk, I actually am rather excited about these Ambari changes. It's actually really nice coming from previously it was very heavily focused in an operational aspect of running Accumulo, and I was very familiar with commands like pdsh and pdcp and manually diffing config files across many nodes. So stuff with Ambari is really great. Every time I come back to it every 6 months, it's always much better, and it's really exciting to see this coming in. But Kerberos. So 6 months ago, I knew just about nothing about Kerberos, and now I know ever so slightly more about Kerberos. It's really probably the most unknown aspect in the Hadoop ecosystem. There's next to no documentation on the subject, and it's always this sort of thing in the room of, well, someone told me I should run with Kerberos once, but I don't really know what it does. But they said it was really important. So hopefully we can try to demystify a little bit of that today. Kerberos itself is a protocol for authentication. It's been around for ages, and it was primarily designed to help you have trusted authentication over a network that you don't trust. So if you think about running on the internet, running on EC2, this is something where you don't actually control the network. You don't know if someone else is sniffing, watching your traffic. Kerberos is a way to sort of help you ensure that you have strong authentication between two nodes, that you can say, I know node 1 is talking to node 2, and I know that node 1 is who it says it is, and node 2 is who it says it is. Nothing at all to do with authorization. So that's a really key point to keep in mind, because otherwise you'll get confused thinking, how the heck does this thing do authorization? Within Hadoop itself, it actually in practice feels more like sort of like a single sign-on. So when you authenticate with Kerberos, suddenly now you can access HDFS, you can connect to Zookeeper and look around there. With this new additions to Accumulo, you can seamlessly log in and start accessing Accumulo. So it's really nice in the regard of now you don't have to have, well, can anyone go and see stuff in HDFS? How do you let me go and provision user accounts in Accumulo? If you're using other tools like Hive that also have authorization modules in them, it's really nice in that regard. The crux of Kerberos itself is that there is a centralized server that handles key distribution called the KDC. Essentially, when you have a user, a principal, they have some password or key tab file that essentially is, you can think of a key tab as a password, really just in file form. It's as sensitive. If you lose a key tab, it's the same as losing your password. But essentially, this is what lets you identify yourself with the KDC and ultimately complete a handshake with whatever server you're trying to connect to. In addition to your server, your client trying to connect out, there's also the other side of it that you want to make sure that you're not accidentally talking to a different service. So you know that I am who you are who you are, and the server is who you think it is. So these are really the importance for Kerberos, and actually why it's relevant at all in HDFS. So like Billy said, Accumulo has had some Kerberos support. The difference is that it was only server-side up until the to-be-released 1.7.0 release. This means that Accumulo could run on a HDFS and Zookeeper instance that was configured to use Kerberos, but you were still going to have to deal with usernames and passwords all over the place for Accumulo. The joy in myself as a developer for actually making this work is that Thrift is awesome. Thrift has a bunch of abstraction layers that let you instantiate different types of servers, so the actual RPC mechanism underneath the hood. For example, in 1.6.0, I think, they introduced the ability to use SSL for making connections. The same sort of thing works here with 1.7. Thrift has a magical server that we can use that uses SASL. So SASL is a simple authentication and security layer, but you can kind of think of it as like an interface for RPC libraries. There are various, there's a formal specification for SASL, and you can fit different authentication protocols on top of that. So for using Kerberos, we use the GSS API, which is capable of speaking Kerberos. I promise I will try to use less acronyms henceforth. SASL is also really nice because it provides some extra things, like encryption is one thing. So they have a notion of a quality of protection. By default, you're just getting that authentication, which is why we're using Kerberos in the first place, but you can actually ratchet that up and also gain things like encryption. Things like SSL currently don't work with SASL in the Thrift implementation, so it's really you want to choose one or the other in this case. Like Billy mentioned in the beginning, the need to create users in Accumulo is sort of invalidated like this. When you're using Kerberos, Kerberos itself is acting as, the KDC is acting as a centralized source of what users exist. So all you have to do is use KInit and enter your password or use a key tab, and boom, you can open a shell, you can launch a MapReduce job, you can do all sorts of fun stuff. Functionally, when you're actually using this, you'll see a few differences. One decision we made, which I have later found out is a little bit different than what some of the other components in the Hadoop ecosystem do, is that we actually use the full Kerberos principle. So in this case here, username, Josh, myself. You can have an optional instance here, which is a specification that this principle is only valid on a specific host. So one of the major tenets in Kerberos is that DNS must be set up correctly to actually validate that a host is who it says it is. In this case here, Hortonworks.com is the domain, so that means the user Josh is valid in this realm, Hortonworks.com. It wouldn't be relevant in Accumulo.net, hypothetically. Additionally, the concept of a root user in Accumulo no longer exists because you don't have a root principle. You want to have this strong authentication to know that this principle is tied to this individual or service. So it doesn't really make sense to have this sort of floating user that you're just kind of saying, oh, well, Bob and Jane, they might have the password, they could be root, but maybe Frank saw it on their computer one day, so he might be root too. It gets rid of this whole issue so you can really have a strong authentication model to know exactly who is who, and it really helps in the audit chain to know, did somebody do something that they shouldn't have done? MapReduce is a fun caveat to this whole otherwise nicely architected security model. Kerberos, as I was saying, it's been around for a long time, and it kind of started back when it was, we had a more stronger emphasis on client-server models. So we didn't have these, hundreds to thousands of nodes and operating on a single network, interacting with each other. As such, the KDC sort of doesn't handle this notion of saying, well, I have 1,000 nodes in one Hadoop cluster. Doesn't really work so well. MapReduce kind of makes this even worse because then you have n nodes talking to hypothetically n other nodes. So pretty much what that means is now you have n squared requests that might be going and hitting the KDC all at once, and that is a denial of service attack. So some of the old engineers at Yahoo came up with a different way to get around this. This is the other dark corner of Hadoop called the delegation token, which really should just be renamed to a time-based shared secret. It took me literally 3 months to figure that out. So the fun part is that all this is really doing is saying the only time that when you're running some process on a distributed set of nodes, the only time we actually know the user is who they say they are is when they submit the task. So when you launch a MapReduce job, you're submitting an RPC to the resource manager. When you're connecting, just leave it at that. After you launch this task, eventually it goes out to the node managers, and you really don't want to be sharing your Kerberos, essentially your password, out to all these node managers. Hopefully it's trusted, but keep your password as close as you can is always a good rule when you're dealing with security. So it kind of makes this sacrifice of saying, well, if we make this short-lived password and we do our absolute best inside of Hadoop itself to protect that from anyone else who might be on the system, we can be reasonably certain that we can run this job safely. So what really, delegation tokens on the server side really just turn out to be a sort of a side channel in the RPC system to say, if I see this special credential coming across, let me check the validity, so the time-based aspect of that token, and then verify that this short-lived password is actually valid for who they say they are. This resulted in a little bit of extra work inside of Accumulo itself. Hopefully, if you're using the right API calls and what we have in Accumulo itself in the public API, the input format and the output format, it should actually be transparent to you. So what will happen is that you'll just use your normal authentication, and behind the scenes it will go and request a delegation token, do the right things in the job, and move along your merry way. Metrics.
Before we leave Kerberos, I also wanted to mention the Ambari is now coming out with a Kerberos wizard that I'm extremely excited about. Basically, you issue a few commands to set up your KDC, create one admin principal, then you can go into the Ambari UI, start up the Kerberos wizard, you give it the admin principal and the principal's password, and then it will automatically create all the principals and key tabs needed for the services you've configured. So for Accumulo, that means all the service key tabs and the root principal, and its key tab, and also one for the tracer. So you're like clicking through, and then it stops all the services and restarts them in Kerberos mode. So it makes trying out Kerberos extremely easy and is really fantastic.
So the final component we want to talk about, metrics. So like we said, Ambari is really good at doing distributed monitoring. It's really good at controlling configuration, starting and stopping processes. But one of the things we really have to do to actually display what's going on in a Hadoop cluster is we actually have to have good instrumentation on each of the components that are in our Hadoop cluster. If we don't have the data, we can't really express anything back to a user, nor do fancy things like saying, what happened when I saw this latency spike from the user end? Hadoop Metrics2 is a library just included in Hadoop. It's actually not new at all. It's been around for a couple years. It was a redesign off of Metrics. It was the one at the time. But it's essentially designed around this notion of having sources and sinks. So a metrics source would be some producer of metrics. So a tablet server has metrics, is a metric source. A sink would be somewhere that this data gets written to. So like we were saying earlier, systems like Ganglia or Graphite would be metric sinks. The great part about why everyone really likes Metrics2 is that it sort of acts as an intermediary between this push-pull model. Previously with Accumulo, if you actually wanted to hook up a system like Ganglia, you had to have some service sitting in the middle like JMX trans, which would actually pull metrics from the source and write them out to the sink. And this is really it's kind of ew, because you don't want, if you want to have good monitoring in your system, you don't want to be standing up more processes all the time to do that. You just want to have the least number of components you have because, well, you want to go home at 5 o'clock. This is also sort of complementary to the distributed tracing APIs that Billy had talked about earlier. Distributed tracing is really good at saying, given some operation in the system, what took the longest amounts of time to do it, what were the steps I had to take, whereas the stuff that we're really capturing with Metrics2 is we want to see what is the current state at some time t in the system. So how many active compactions we're running, what was the size of the queued compactions, things like that. One nice thing that you get out of the box, like I guess you did if you could do if you enabled it previous versions of Accumulo, is that metrics will get automatically published to an MBeam. You can use your favorite tool. I always use JVisual VM. So you get a nice view broken down in this tree view here. You can see things such as queue compactions, active compactions, scans running against the system. You have some nice instrumentation for the thrift thread pools themselves serving the RPC. It's a lot of nice information. You actually don't have to do anything else, and you can get this out of the box now with Metrics2. When you download 1.7.0, when it's released, this will be enabled by default. The previous implementation of metrics, that was a sort of custom thing internal to Accumulo itself. That support is still there if you did do the work to instrument that yourself. There is a property that you can turn on to enable the old version. There's a nice section in the user manual I wrote up that can give you some more information about this if you do have something. Hopefully we haven't broken you. There is also an example configuration file if you're still doing this by hand. I believe Ambari will put this in there by default for you, and you can configure it as such. It's really nice then. You just go uncomment some lines, put in some host details, and suddenly you have metrics data flowing to Graphite or Ganglia. Yeah, so it's really cool. Anything else? Any questions anyone has? Sure. For HDP or Accumulo 1.7? I have no idea. When is Ambari 2.1 going to be released? Do you know?
I'm not totally sure. I would think maybe something like June or over the summer. Does that seem about right?
I was going to say mid to late May or early June would be my guess.
Great.
Well, thank you for coming. I hope you learned something. I hope it wasn't boring you to death at the last talk of the day. And if you have any questions, feel free to check us out. If Billy and I aren't at the Hortonworks booth, there's a bunch of fine gentlemen, and they can hopefully answer your questions. If not, they can track us down and pull us over and give you some FaceTime. Thank you.